Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Is the sound on? Microphone check. Welcome to the America First Policy Institute. My name is Brooke Rollins. I have had the incredible honor and huge humbling experience of leading the America First Policy Institute alongside almost now 140 of our fellow staffers and team members from around the country. We know that just now 1 year plus into the Biden administration, it's clear that its watchword is extremism and its legacy is disaster. Back in September of 2020, there was a lot of predictions about how this administration would indeed govern, and now we know what exactly that looks like. In every sphere, this term has been met with defeat after defeat, from a lost war in Afghanistan to a looming war in Europe, which is what we will talk about today, to roaring inflation, to supply chain breakdowns, to out-of-control crime, to an uncontrolled pandemic, to the crisis at the border and beyond. What the difference is in just 1 year is moving from an America First agenda, which is what we're working so hard on here at the America First Policy Institute, to something that is not America First. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today. What an honor it is to have so many wonderful people here with us in person in Washington, D.C. at our AFPI headquarters, and so many tens of thousands of you watching on the live stream. It's a great honor to have my dear friend of more than 20 years, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, along with so many of our extraordinary leaders from the AFPI Center for American Security. Thank you all for joining us today again for this very important conversation. Russia's unprovoked war of aggression in Ukraine rightly commands our attention as the most immediate and potentially the most dangerous national security crisis of our time. So it is more than appropriate that the America First Policy Institute convene this conversation with the men who have made the safety, security, and sovereignty of the American people their life's work, and you will get to hear from them in just one moment. Of course, these are my distinguished AFPI colleagues, friends, and brothers, Chad Wolf, Steve Yates, Director John Ratcliffe, Fred Fleitz, and General Keith Kellogg. Each of you has given a lifetime of devotion to America, and our country is in your debt. Our own distinguished United States Senator from Texas, my great friend and old companion in the fight for liberty, Ted Cruz, is also here. Senator, we are so grateful for your willingness to join us always, and for your generosity in sharing your unparalleled insight into these extraordinary times. At a moment when American leadership in the world is deeply uncertain and the White House is in weak hands, your presence in Washington, D.C. is both steadying and reassuring, and we thank you. Now it's my great honor to introduce my dear friend, another Texan, John Ratcliffe, who served in Congress for over 5 years, where he was a leading policy maker on national security issues as a member of the House Intelligence and Judiciary Committees and as cybersecurity chairman on the Homeland Security Committee, serving as the 6th director of national intelligence under President Donald Trump, otherwise known as America's top spy, and was awarded the National Security Medal for his extraordinary lifetime achievements in this space. Please help me welcome the wonderful Director John Ratcliffe. Thank you all again.
Good morning. Thank you, Brooke. Today's discussion is a critical one, not just because of the tragedy that has been unfolding in Ukraine, but because it's an opportunity for us to discuss whether it could have been avoided at all, and now that it is happening, what should be America's role moving forward to help in a constructive way to bring about a successful conclusion. The question that I get most relates to the former, whether this should be happening at all. And my colleagues that served in the prior administration get that question a lot, and I usually respond by saying, you already know the answer to that question, whether or not it would have happened, because it didn't happen. Like a lot of things that didn't happen in the prior administration, things like a demoralizing defeat for our military in Afghanistan, chaos at our southern border, Iran pushing around American diplomats at the negotiating table, China flying 49 sorties into Taiwan's air defense identification zone in a single day. None of these things happened in the prior administration. All of these things are happening now. And it's not as simple as a matter of personalities. It's not as simple as the difference between a President Trump and a President Biden, although that is a significant difference. But it has to do with the policies of these administrations and the policies that make a difference and that the American people are now seeing with great clarity are having a profound impact around the world. We call that the America First policies. Policies that show that when you focus on America being prosperous and safer and more secure, not just Americans benefit, but the world benefits. Our allies are safer, more secure, and more prosperous, and our adversaries are deterred. We're fortunate today to have a great partner, someone who has been fighting for those principles and for those policies for so long. Senator Ted Cruz represents, of course, 29 million Texans, including me, in the United States Senate. Everyone knows his bio by heart almost at this point. He's a Princeton graduate, undergraduate, Harvard Law School. As the Solicitor General in my state of Texas, he argued 8 times before the Supreme Court. Has a wonderful family, his wife Heidi, his children Caroline and Catherine. As a United States Senator, Senator Cruz has led on so many issues, designating North Korea as a state sponsor of terror, legendary fights against Obamacare and its impact on hundreds of millions of Americans, more recently leading the fight to stop Nord Stream 2 and give Russia energy control over Europe. He's been fighting big tech. He's been fighting for our Texas border. He's been fighting since he got here in Washington. Really from the beginning, Senator Cruz. So many of us remember shortly after you got here, when you spent 21 hours on your feet reading Green Eggs and Ham in an effort to stop Obamacare, and while initially deterred, kept fighting, and years later authored the legislation that did successfully end the Obamacare individual mandate. Senator Cruz hasn't just been fighting against failed liberal ideologies. He hasn't just been fighting for conservative principles that make Americans safer and stronger and more prosperous and that stand for freedom and liberty. He's also been fighting against a Washington that sometimes sees itself as a system independent of the American people and the people that it is supposed to be representing. That's where our personal paths crossed initially. Brooke mentioned my time in Congress, and when I ran for Congress, there were 27 members, I think, of the Texas delegation that were Republicans, 25 in the House of Representatives, and of course our 2 senators. And when I ran for Congress, it was I did an unpopular thing. I ran against an incumbent Republican, a very nice gentleman, but he'd been in Washington for 34 years. And when I ran, 26 of 27 legislators from the state of Texas did what those in Washington often do, which is endorse the incumbent. Only one didn't. Senator Ted Cruz was the only one that said, I think I'm going to sit this one out and let Texans decide who should represent them in that congressional district. And it made a difference. It really made a difference in my race. And it just shows how Ted Cruz started when he got to Washington and how he has continued to make a difference. And it's why we're so honored to have him here today, Senator Ted Cruz.
Well, thank you very much, John. Thank you for the terrific introduction. Let me say to all of the tremendous leadership here at AFPI, Brooke and John and Keith and Fred and Chad, you guys do an amazing job. These are tremendous leaders for our country, leaders who make a real difference. I will say, John, I was particularly amused at Brooke's introduction of you as America's top spy. I'm hoping in the future when you introduce yourself at the bar, it will simply be Bond, James Bond. I haven't seen you order a martini, but I'm looking forward to it. I think I know how you'll do so. It is great to be here. It's great to be here at a time of real consequence in the world. Foreign policy, how America interacts with the world, it always matters. But it particularly matters right now. It matters right now because it is a dangerous time. It matters right now because the enemies of America are resurgent. And that makes America at far greater peril. I want to talk this morning about what does it mean to have an America First foreign policy. And I'm going to start at the theoretical level and then bring it to very real practical implications, focusing on the war on Ukraine. But let's start with a framework. You know, for a long time, folks in Washington viewed Republican foreign policy as really two poles. There were either the interventionists, who looked across the globe and said, we must protect democracy, and at times it seems there was never a country they didn't want to invade. That the first answer was always send the Marines. And I got to say, there are quite a few of my colleagues in the Senate that still embrace that view of foreign policy. There is, on the other side, the isolationists that look to the world and see a lot of scary people out there, and their answer is, let's pull back. Let's stay behind the two oceans that surround America, and let's not be involved in the world. And I got to say, my view of those two poles has always been they're both wrong. That neither one of them is a sound or sensible view for American foreign policy, and neither one of them, I think, is where the American people are. The American people typically don't spend a lot of time theorizing on these questions, but the American people have a gut instinct that is very sound. I've always considered my own views a third point on the triangle. And that third point, the way I typically describe it, is that I'm a non-interventionist hawk. What does that mean? It means that the vital touchstone for all American foreign policy should be the critical national security interest of the United States. Any question of foreign policy, any question of military intervention should turn on that question. How does this keep America safe? If it's necessary to keep America safe, we should do it. If it's not, we should not. It also means that we should be very reluctant to put our sons and daughters in harm's way. Very reluctant to engage in military conflict, and if and when military force is needed, we should go in, win, and then get the hell out. The job of our military is not nation building. The job of our military is not invading distant lands and transforming them into Switzerland. The job of our military is very simple: to kill our enemies, and preferably to scare the hell out of them enough that you don't even have to kill your enemies. Deterrence is powerful, and one of the things to understand, any president, any government has a range of tools. You have, number one, the bully pulpit. The most powerful tool in foreign policy is the voice of the President of the United States. You have diplomacy, the active engagement of American foreign policy with our allies and with our enemies. You have sanctions. And being the world's economic superpower, in addition to military superpower, gives us the ability to use sanctions surgically to advance our interests. And you have, finally, direct military force, which should only be used when the first three have failed and it's necessary to keep Americans safe. Now, let's talk about Ukraine. We are today in the first major land war in Europe since 1945, since World War II. What is maddening about that is that it was utterly preventable. This did not have to happen. And it was caused by two specific mistakes from Joe Biden and his team. The first was the catastrophic surrender and withdrawal in Afghanistan. The surrender to the Taliban, the incompetence of doing so, abandoning Bagram airfield before we evacuated, leaving Americans behind. The chaos and weakness and incompetence. When that happened, all across the globe, America's enemies looked to Washington. And they took the measure of the man in the Oval Office, and sadly, they concluded that President Biden was weak and feckless and ineffective. And a weak president is dangerous. When that happened at the time, I said publicly, I said the chances of Putin invading Ukraine just rose tenfold. By the way, I also said the chances of China invading Taiwan just rose tenfold. Our enemies take a measure of who we are. And weakness is provocative. This is something the left often misunderstands. If you look at the Biden foreign policy, it seems as if every enemy of America, they go out of their way to appease, to show weakness to, and often to try to shovel billions of dollars to. That's combined with systematically alienating and antagonizing our friends and allies. I meet with a lot of ambassadors, a lot of foreign ministers, a lot of heads of states. You talk to our friends, our allies, they are almost to a person flabbergasted. Because they wonder, should we be hostile to America? Would this administration like us better if we stood like the Ayatollah and chanted death to America? Mistake number one was the disaster in Afghanistan, but mistake number two is very singularly focused on Ukraine. And it concerns Nord Stream 2. Now let's back up a second. Putin didn't wake up yesterday and decide that he wanted to invade Ukraine. Putin has wanted to invade Ukraine for decades. Putin is a KGB thug with megalomaniacal ambitions. And he yearns to reassemble the old Soviet Union. And if you read the speech he gave just before the invasion, his ambitions are broader than that. He desires to reassemble the Russian Empire of 1922. He looks back fondly at what he sees as days of Russian glory, and he wants those back. And in fact, he has invaded Ukraine before. 2014, he rolled into Crimea, the southern part of Ukraine, but he stopped. He did not invade the entirety of the country. Why? Well, the reason is simple. Russia's principal source of revenue is oil and gas. John McCain used to say, Russia is a gas station with a country attached. And Putin is a petro-tyrant. The funding for this war comes from selling oil and gas. And when it comes to natural gas, that natural gas goes on pipelines right through the middle of Ukraine. That's how the gas gets to Europe. And Putin had a problem in 2014 when he was looking at invading the rest of Ukraine, that if he invaded, he risked damaging or destroying those pipelines, which would mean that he couldn't get his gas to market. So the next year, Putin set about trying to fix that. And he began building a new pipeline. That pipeline is called Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 goes under the ocean directly from Russia to Germany, skips Ukraine altogether. The purpose of Nord Stream 2 was simple. When Nord Stream 2 was complete, Putin could invade Ukraine. And he didn't have to worry about the pipelines anymore because he would have an alternative pipeline to get his gas to market. So as Putin was building the pipeline, I'll tell you, there was a consensus in Washington, this is a really bad thing, but there's nothing we can do about it. Well, in 2019, I authored sanctions legislation that was surgically designed to stop Nord Stream 2, to bankrupt any company that built the deep sea pipeline. At the time, in the summer of 2019, Russia was engaged in active disinformation, and by the way, not the fake Washington Post kind. The real kind in Europe. They were saying there's no chance on earth that this sanctions legislation will ever pass. It's impossible to pass. And this pipeline cannot be stopped. It is inevitable. That was the narrative being pushed by the Russia propaganda outlets. Well, as with most disinformation, it proved to be directly false. And in December of 2019, we passed that sanctions legislation, overwhelming bipartisan support in the House, overwhelming bipartisan support in the Senate, and President Trump signed it into law. Now that passed in December of 2019. If y'all remember what else was happening in December 2019, the House was literally in the middle of impeaching President Trump over Ukraine. And we're trying to pass a bill concerning Ukraine. It remains, I think, a political miracle that that got done. And I will tell you, as the Democrats were foaming in the mouth with partisan rage at President Trump, my effort in pushing this forward was simply not to mention the word Ukraine at all. This says all to Russia. No, I never heard of Ukraine. Sorry, what? No, I don't know anything about that. This is just Russia. Now, if you want to know whether sanctions work, you can definitively answer that question. Because Putin stopped building the Nord Stream 2 pipeline literally the day President Trump signed my sanctions legislation into law. That day, they halted construction. For a year, Nord Stream 2 was dead. It was a hunk of metal at the bottom of the ocean. In December of 2020, I authored a second set of sanctions on Nord Stream 2 that were even tougher, ratcheting up the sanctions even more. That likewise passed overwhelming bipartisan support in the House, the Senate. President Trump signed it into law as well. Nord Stream 2 had been killed, and without a way to get gas to market, Russia could not invade Ukraine. Then Joe Biden becomes president. He's sworn into office on January 20th, 2021. Putin resumed deep sea construction of Nord Stream 2 on January 24th, 2021. Literally 4 days after Biden put his hand on the Bible. Why did he do that? He did that because the Biden administration had telegraphed weakness and surrender on this issue. Building Nord Stream 2 was Putin's #1 foreign policy objective. Why? Because completing Nord Stream 2 let him invade Ukraine. the spring of last year, Biden formally waived sanctions on Nord Stream 2. When he did so, the government of Ukraine formally put out a statement saying, Mr. President, if you do this, Putin will invade Ukraine. That same day, the government of Poland formally put out a statement saying, President Biden, if you waive sanctions on Nord Stream 2, Putin will invade Ukraine. I stood on the Senate floor and I said, Mr. President, if you do this, we will see Russian tanks in the streets of Kiev. I very much wish that had proven false. Now, why did Biden do this? In addition to weakness and incompetence, Democrats, when it comes to foreign policy, they view foreign policy as a projection of their domestic policy. So domestically, they divide the country into red states and blue states. And domestically, they want to favor the blue states, give them lots of money, and they want to screw with the red states. And it's all politics. If you're their friends, you get a subsidy. If you're their enemy, they may come lock you up. When it comes to foreign policy, the Biden White House views foreign policy the exact same way. They divide foreign countries into red countries and blue countries. Bizarrely enough, the red countries are countries that want to be friends with us. So there are countries like Israel, there are countries like Brazil, there are countries like India, all of whom are pivoting towards America, are embracing America, want to be friends with us. And in the Biden White House's view, that makes them bad. And the blue countries are countries like Iran, countries like Venezuela, countries like Cuba. And they don't admit it, but also countries like Russia and China. And why did Biden waive these sanctions? He waived them. A senior member of my team has a phrase that is evocative, which is that the Biden foreign policy team, they sleep with votive candles of Angela Merkel under their beds. And on the red country, blue country, they looked at Merkel and they saw her as a founding member of the resistance. Just like they hated Donald Trump, Merkel did too, and Angela Merkel wanted this pipeline, and therefore we should give her what she wanted. It was staggeringly foolish. When Biden did so, I announced holds on every nominee to the State Department. That made Foggy Bottom quite unhappy. At first, they thought they could respond by planning nasty stories coming after me. I was particularly amused, one of the first ones, I think in Politico, said, there are empty mansions in Europe where the U.S. ambassador should stride because of this crazy clown Cruz. And I remember thinking, okay, if you think that not having rich Democrat donors in fancy mansions with fancy wine is somehow a bad thing for 29 million Texans, you've never met a Texan. With the Biden administration, I told them I'll place these holds unless and until you follow the law and sanction Nord Stream 2. December of last year, the holds were stacked up. The Biden administration was freaking out. They wanted to get some of their nominees through. So I negotiated a deal with Chuck Schumer. But unfortunately for Democrats, partisan politics was a higher priority than national security. And it is amazing if you go back and look at the level of political capital the Biden White House spent to try to defeat this bill. We ended up winning the vote. Vote was 55 to 44. It was a big bipartisan win. 6 Democrats voted with us. Unfortunately, that meant 44 Democrats didn't. And it was amazing, on the day of the vote, Joe Biden actually came to Capitol Hill. It was, I think, only the second time since he's been president that he has done that. He came to Capitol Hill personally, and he was directly lobbying Democratic senators, one after the other, twisting their arms, saying, please, 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 vote against these sanctions. Now, we won the vote 55-44, so that means we won, right? Well, no. Because ironically, literally on the same day that Democrats were giving speeches describing the filibuster as a racist relic of the past, as modern-day Jim Crow, that's their language, on the same day, they filibustered to prevent sanctions against Putin and Russia. And because we didn't get 60, we only got 55, the matter failed. By the way, at the time of the vote, President Zelensky publicly called out to the Senate. Russian tanks were massed on the border of Ukraine. President Zelensky publicly said to the Senate, if you want to stop this invasion, vote for Cruz's sanctions. Because that's the only way to stop this invasion. 44 Democrats ignored Ukraine's desperate plea. And just weeks later, the Russian tanks began to invade. Now, what should we be doing now? Well, let's start with the principles that I described as being a non-interventionist hawk. By the way, another way of putting that is America first. Another way of putting that is the way Reagan did decades ago, peace through strength. They're all conveying the same thing. It's worth remembering Reagan. In 8 years, the biggest country Ronald Reagan ever invaded was Grenada. But he also won the Cold War without firing a shot and bankrupted the Soviet Union because he used the bully pulpit powerfully. Many of y'all have been to my office in D.C. My office in D.C., the dominant feature is a gigantic painting, it's probably 20 feet wide, of Reagan standing in front of the Brandenburg Gate with the words, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, in German, in the style of the graffiti that was on the wall. Those words were powerful. By the way, the backstory, a lot of people don't know, 3 times the State Department edited those words out of the speech. And 3 times Reagan wrote them back with his own hand. And the State Department argued, they said, Mr. President, you can't say this. This is too aggressive, it's too bellicose, it's too provocative. And here was their killer. And Mr. President, it's unrealistic. We all know that the Berlin Wall will stand for eternity. That failure is the only option, that victory is impossible. And Reagan, with a twinkle in his eye, he said, you don't understand, this is the whole point of the speech. Less than 3 years after Reagan gave that speech, the Berlin Wall was torn to the ground. And critically, it wasn't knocked down by American tanks. It wasn't demolished by American missiles. It was taken down by leadership, by vision. Some time ago, I sat down with Natan Sharansky in Jerusalem, the famed Soviet dissident. He told me about the Soviet gulags. People would pass from cell to cell notes. Did you hear what Reagan said? Evil empire, ash heap of history. Tear down this wall. American leadership shines through. What should we be doing with Ukraine? Winning, but not putting American servicemen and women in harm's way. Nobody in their right mind wants to see a shooting war between Russia and the United States. What does that mean specifically? Well, to understand what we should do, we should understand why we're doing it. And I got to say, when it comes to Republicans, there's some Republicans, particularly some of my colleagues, that when they talk about Ukraine, it makes me want to pull the hair out of my head. I've heard Republican colleagues of mine get up and say, we must protect democracy. We have an obligation to defend international norms. And I look at him and say, what the hell are you talking about? We are not in an Ivy League faculty lounge. The job of the U.S. military is not to protect democracy, it's not to protect international norms, and it's not to punish red countries. The job of the military is to protect American lives and national security, to keep our children safe. But does that mean we have no interest in Russia and Ukraine? Of course not. Why? Because Russia is our enemy. Because Putin hates us and wants to kill us. And it is not in America's national security interest to see our enemies get stronger. If Putin succeeds in reassembling the Soviet Union, Putin gets stronger, Russia gets stronger. The world was not safer in the Cold War, with a Soviet Union that was a superpower with an arsenal of nuclear weapons capable of threatening the lives of hundreds of millions of Americans. I'm not old enough to remember in the 1960s huddling under my school desk in nuclear drills. But there's some in this room that are. The world was not safer when that was the case. If we want to protect America's interest, we want to keep Russia weak, and we want our friends strong. What does that mean? That means, number one, avoiding a shooting war with Russia. So there's some that are calling for a no-fly zone. Now listen, I understand why the Ukrainian government wants it. If I were in the Ukrainian government, I'd want a no-fly zone too. The problem is a no-fly zone enforced by America means you have American pilots and American fighter jets directly and kinetically contesting Russian pilots and Russian fighter jets. And the odds are unacceptably high, one or the other shoots the other. And that's how you find yourself in a shooting war with Russia. So I am emphatically opposed to an American no-fly zone because I'm not willing to send my children to go fight Russian soldiers over this. But I am willing to support the Ukrainians sending their children to defend their country. And I have to say the Ukrainians are engaged in an incredible act of heroism. You know, listening to the Biden foreign policy team, Joe Biden and his entire team believed from the beginning that failure is inevitable. The briefings they gave to the Senate over and over again, they said this will be over in days. Russian army will roll in, Ukraine will surrender, game over. That was wildly, profoundly wrong. By the way, in a functioning administration, there would be serious reviews of how the hell did all of you get this so badly wrong? Because every foreign policy cabinet member and generals with lots of brass stood in front of us and told us things that are just demonstrably laughable. Because they underestimated the ability of the Ukrainians to fight heroically, to defend grandmothers, to throw Molotov cocktails on Russian tanks. But we should be leaning in far more vigorously, providing weapons for the Ukrainians to succeed, providing things like Stingers and Javelins, which we have provided, but at every stage the Biden administration has slow-walked it. Providing things like fighter jets. When we talk with Zelensky, we've had multiple conference calls with Zelensky where he said, we need fighter jets. Poland has MiGs that the Ukrainian pilots are trained on. They know how to fly them. Poland has said they're more than happy to have those MiGs go to Ukraine, and Biden personally vetoed that. Now, to be clear, I don't think American pilots should fly those MiGs. But Ukrainian pilots should be able to pick them up and fly them in. So we should, number one, use our economic might to provide for Ukraine the tools to win this. But number two, where does Russia get its funding to fund this war? And the answer is from the sale of oil and gas. And we need to be vigorously going after Putin's revenue stream. We need to be taking away as customers. As I talk to Ukrainian business leaders, as I talk to the Ukrainian government, there is nothing that would weaken Putin more than seeing European customers who Putin thinks are addicted to Russian oil and gas, seeing European customers cancel their contracts, one after the other after the other. Now, to be clear, Europe is not going to do that just out of the warm kindness of their hearts. Europe's not going to shut out the lights. They're not going to stop heating their homes in the winter. And we can't reasonably ask them to do that. The only way they will do that is if we replace the oil and gas. America is the world's leading superpower, the leading producer of oil in the world, the leading producer of gas in the world. But the Biden administration, because everything is domestic politics to them, has waged a war on American production. At its peak, U.S. production in 2019 was 13 million barrels a day. We're down now at about 11.5. Just part of why gasoline prices are so high. But if we wanted to win, we would be unleashing American production, taking away European customers. And by the way, if you want to see Putin stopped, the one thing that threatens to topple Putin, to turn the oligarchs against him, to turn the remnants of the KGB against him, is if the billions of dollars of revenue from oil and gas sales goes away. And it is what funds Putin's war machine. We can use the tools we have to fight to win. You have to believe victory is possible. And then you need a plan to carry it out. I'll say finally, not only should we win in Ukraine, and by win I mean ensure that Putin loses. Ensure that Putin loses because a stronger Russia that is an enemy of America endangers our security. We also need to not lose sight of the biggest foreign policy challenge of our time, and that is Communist China. And we need to win against China as well. China is the most dangerous geopolitical adversary of the United States for the next 100 years. China has the military might of the Soviet Union with a far stronger economic engine fueling it. And China carries out on a daily basis policies of murder, torture, genocide, slavery, lies, deception. And just like we won the Cold War with a comprehensive strategy, utilizing all the tools we have to stop the Soviet Union, we need to do the same thing with Communist China. Not engage in a hot war. Again, nobody wants to see American soldiers and Chinese soldiers firing tanks at each other. But utilizing the tools we have aggressively, affirmatively, to undermine the tyranny of the Chinese government. And I will say one challenge we have is today's Democratic Party is structurally pro-China. Why is that? Because all of their funders are. Today's Democratic Party is funded by big business, big tech, big Hollywood, and big universities. All of them are in bed with China. And I'll give one illustration. Last year, I forced a vote on the Senate floor on a federal prohibition to federal funds going to purchasing electric vehicles or solar panels made in Xinjiang, made with slave labor in concentration camps. When we voted on the Senate floor, every single Democrat but Joe Manchin voted no. When John Kerry was asked about buying electric vehicles and batteries and solar panels made with slave labor, he said, "That's not my department." I dubbed John Kerry the concentration camp customer of the year. And history's watching us. There's over 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, and the U.S. government is their top customer. There is a complicity with evil that we are responsible for. We need to focus on America. And by the way, the reason we need to defeat China is the same reason we need Putin to lose in Ukraine, the same reason we needed to win the Cold War. It is to protect America's national security interests. It is to focus on America first. That's the commander-in-chief's responsibility, to defend the United States of America. We can do that, and we need to do that. Thank you.
Senator, you never disappoint, always insightful and always inspiring. So thank you so much for your remarks. But before you rush off back to Capitol Hill, I wanted to ask you a question. You talk and did this morning about how the world is, in many respects, divided into friends and enemies, allies and adversaries. And you talked powerfully about how Russia and China fall into a very clear category. But in some cases, it's not a bright line. So give us your perspective on a country like Saudi Arabia that is an important counterbalance to a hegemonic Iran, but also has a questionable history on human rights. So how should we deal with a country like Saudi Arabia?
Look, it's a great question.
Here, I'm going to move over to this because I think this... It's a great question, and I think you can divide the world into friends and enemies, and there's another category that I've used, which is problematic allies. And problematic allies, the principal countries that fall into that are Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan. Now, all of those are countries with serious challenges, serious human rights abuses, serious problems, both at home and abroad, but there are also countries whose friendship and alliance is important to us, who, from a national security perspective, we want aligned with us. The Saudis, prior to 9/11, far too many Saudis were funding bin Laden on the principle of if you feed the alligator, maybe he'll eat you last. That's a problem. At the same time, I'm a big believer in strengthening our relationship with Saudi Arabia. Why? As a counterbalance to Iran. The leadership of Saudi Arabia doesn't want to murder us. The Ayatollah does. Just this week, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, was testifying. And I took the opportunity to ask him about the Iran deal. And in particular, the Iran deal, thankfully, is stalled right now because Iran is demanding that the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, be delisted as a terrorist organization. Now, mind you, the IRGC is directly responsible for murdering over 600 servicemen and women in Iraq. They are an unabashed terrorist organization. But they also, quite amazingly, are currently today trying to murder former senior national security officials of the United States. The State Department filed a notification with Congress that it's spending $2 million a month on security for former officials, and most notably former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. $2 million a month to protect him from Iran's efforts to murder him. Secret Service is doing the same thing with John Bolton, former National Security Advisor. And so I asked Secretary Blinken, I said, is it true, number one, that state is spending $2 million a month on security for these officials? He said yes, confirmed it in the hearing. And then I asked, is it true, as it's been publicly reported, that the State Department asked Iran, as part of this nuclear deal, will you stop trying to murder former senior officials of the American government? And Iran told you no. And Blinken said, well, I can't discuss this in an open setting, but I'm happy to talk in a classified sense. I said, what? This isn't classified. What utter nonsense. Explain to me how this works, that you're sitting there with Chardonnay in Vienna. And I asked him, actually my favorite question is I asked him, I said, Secretary Blinken, would you agree that trying to murder the U.S. Secretary of State is a big damn deal? And Tony was forced to laugh and say, yeah, okay, I do agree with that. Then what the hell are you doing? Why do we want Saudi Arabia strong? Because Saudi Arabia is the principal counterweight to Iran in the Middle East. And unfortunately, because this administration wants an Iran nuclear deal, they want Saudi Arabia weak. It's backwards. So dealing with a problematic ally, there are no magic formulas. I will say there is some irony as gasoline prices have skyrocketed and the Biden White House realized suddenly that people don't like $6 and $7 gas. Their behavior is bizarre in that they don't want more U.S. production, but they promptly ran to Venezuela and to Iran and said, hey, could you guys produce more? They literally want enemies of America who want to murder us to have billions of dollars rather than America producing our own energy. And they went to the Saudis, and I got to say, this administration has been so nasty to the Saudis that a lot of our Middle East allies are saying, why would we stand with a government that undermines us at every level? And when they went and asked the Saudis to produce more, the Saudis basically laughed at them, said, you don't get to spend a year and a half undermining us at every step and then ask us to be your friends. And so dealing with a problematic ally, the way to do so is to keep American national security interests in line. So, with Saudi Arabia, for example, I've supported providing them weaponry, selling them weapons. They have plenty of money to buy our weapons, to use to fight Iran. Why? I want Iran weakened because Iran wants to murder us. At the same time, a couple of years ago, when President Trump was president, you'll recall there was a moment where the Saudis began flooding the oil markets with massive amounts of oil and caused the prices to plummet in a way that was doing real damage to American producers. And I got on the phone with the Saudis and expressed my displeasure in clear and unequivocal words. I think the way you deal with a problematic ally is the same way you deal with a friend or enemy, which is you keep American national security interest in mind and you put it first. And a final story I'll tell that's not Saudi Arabia, but it's Turkey. So Erdogan, look, Turkey is a NATO ally. We have a huge base there that is incredibly important. Turkey is also, Erdogan is quite problematic as a leader. And I will say, when Erdogan came to the United States and he was meeting with President Trump in the Oval, Trump invited 5 senators to come join the meeting. So I was one of the 5. And it was one of the most unusual meetings I've ever been at. And it was probably a 2-hour meeting. And the president spoke maybe 10 minutes, which you've been in a lot of meetings with the president. That was unusual for Donald Trump to only speak 10 minutes. And I think Erdogan came in thinking that the Congress was basically a rubber stamp for Trump where the parliament will do whatever he tells us. And I think it was a very savvy move on Trump's part because we sat there and basically went at it with Erdogan. And at the time we said, look, if you want to have the Russian S-400 anti-missile defense systems, you're not going to get the F-35. So you pick one or the other, but we're not interested in our premier fighter jet being able to be reverse engineered with our enemies' weapons to fight against it. And Erdogan didn't believe us. And I told him, look, I told Erdogan directly, I said, you need to understand, if we vote on it in the U.S. Senate, I've got 95 votes to shut off every F-35 to Turkey, as long as you keep the S-400. So you make a choice. And Erdogan says, well, we want to keep doing business with Russia. I said, that's fine. I'm not saying you can't engage in commerce with them. I'm saying you can't have their advanced anti-missile and anti-fighter jet system designed to shoot down F-35s and also have the F-35s next to them and use them together. You don't get both. Make a choice. And then I said, secondly, you can't try to exterminate the Kurds. The Kurds have been allies of America, heroically standing with us over and over and over again. And I have to admit, America has not been a faithful ally of the Kurds, sadly. And it was very amusing because Trump, we're lighting into Erdogan, and Trump kind of looks at us, looks at Erdogan, and just goes, see what I'm facing. But you deal with a problematic ally. In that meeting, we made very clear, Turkey is our friend. We want you to be our friend. We want you to have the F-35. Just get rid of the damn Russian missile defense system. And so I think those principles, the execution of it is not easy. It's not simple. It's not straightforward. But if you keep your focus on the objective, which is protecting American national security, I think that's the way you do it.
Senator, on behalf of everyone at the America First Policy Institute, thank you for being here this morning. And more importantly, on behalf of all Americans, thank you for always putting America first.
That was an incredible program. Senator Cruz really leaves a hard act to follow. And since we're running a little late, we're going to have a short discussion up here and then move on to questions from the audience. My name is Fred Fleitz. I am the Deputy Chair of the Center for American Security here at the America First Policy Institute. I want to quickly introduce our expert panel. We have General Keith Kellogg, who is the co-chair of AFPI Center for American Security, and I think you all know him from his frequent appearances on Fox News talking about Ukraine. He also was National Security Advisor to both President Donald Trump and Vice President Pence. General, thanks. We also have John Ratcliffe. He is the other co-chairman of AFPI Center for American Security. He served many years in the House of Representatives and several crucial congressional assignments on national security, most notably the House Intelligence Committee. But I think you probably know him not just from his Fox News appearances, but because Director Ratcliffe was was Director of National Intelligence and learned all too many things of being in the belly of the beast in our intelligence community. And we also have Steve Yates. Steve was a Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Cheney. He is the chair of our China Initiative. And we have a super China initiative here for many reasons, not the least of which is that Steve is fluent in Mandarin Chinese. I want to start with a question that dovetails off what Senator Cruz was saying concerning America First and peace through strength. Now, General Kellogg, you and I co-authored an important op-ed recently that appeared in the Western Journal. We also wrote a letter to the editor to the Wall Street Journal, and it was responding to some absurd claims that the America First movement was not pro-Putin. I mean, was not pro-Ukraine and was pro-Putin. Now, we explained how that is absolutely ridiculous, but I was wondering if you could talk about what lessons can we learn from the war in Ukraine concerning peace through strength and America First, and maybe elaborate on the points that we made in our op-ed.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. Well, a lot of people out there have said early on, generally opponents of what we're doing, opponents of the last administration, that America First means you're an isolationist. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, Senator Cruz made a perfect example of that when he talked about the pyramid, where there's the left was isolationism, and the far right is not far right, but the other part of the triangle was active involvement. And there's a third piece, and that's what we call the America First piece. And it's designed really simply, if you just read the Constitution, it's all about we the people. And is it good for America first? And if it's good for Americans first, then it's good. We think it's going to be good not only for us, but for the world as well. When it goes to Ukraine, I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version, the abridged version. When you look at what's happening in Ukraine, we're probably doing it about right now. And the intent is that not to put American troops on the ground, because I think if you're looking out there, the Ukrainians are doing quite well on the ground with the troops that they have there, and they're fighting it exceptionally well. What Zelensky said, and Zelensky, I guess, is the modern-day Winston Churchill, when he says, "I don't need a riot, I need ammunition." You know, that's the kind of guy you want to have a beer with right away. We want to provide him the kit. The question I have had from almost day one is, why haven't we been forcing everybody to provide the kit, the equipment that he needs, and why is it going so slow? Senator Cruz brought up that as a good reason. For example, the jets. Why are the 29 MiGs they're talking about, the MiG-29s from Poland, important? That would increase his Air Force by 1/3. The Russians have not defeated their Air Force yet. There's still air parity, and those jets would help out going forward. The other example is why we didn't provide them long-range artillery. Smart people would know that eventually you're going to get into a conventional fight with the Russians. And what the Russians are good at? They're good at artillery. If you don't believe me, look what happened in Mariupol and other places that are out there where they've used massed artillery strikes. So what you want to do is you want to either match or beat the Russian artillery. That's the reason I have said repeatedly, provide them the heavy howitzers, but also provide them the MLRS. It's what Zelensky has asked for. This is what we need. We have yet to provide that. And you almost have to ask your question, why? And it's almost as Senator Cruz said, you're almost like a step slow. You're always, why are we reacting to them? We should be pushing it forward and pushing it forward very, very hard. And I think part of that is our intelligence assessments. We were wrong in Afghanistan. And remember, we had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff say publicly in front of the Senate, Kyiv would fall within 3 days. Well, he's now missed it by, 61 days? You know, and they're fighting gallantly, and they're being well led, and they're fighting in a Western style. So what we need to do is provide that equipment. Don't have to provide U.S. troops. Provide them things they need. Intelligence. Let them know where the Russians are massing. We have access over the Black Sea. We put our intel assets up, pass that down to the Ukrainians so they can fight well. My hope is that they bleed the Russian army dry. People forget that the Russian army isn't as big as it was in the Cold War. It's an army of only, the professional army, of only about 200,000. After that, they have to go to conscripts. And that army has been hurt very badly. Your top units led the fight. The top units have been mauled. Some people will say they're down to 30% combat. They've lost 30% of their forces. Now, that doesn't say, oh, well, they still got 70%. If you lose 30% of your force, in American standards, you're basically combat ineffective. Because you can't replace those kind of units that you're fighting. Look at the 8 generals that they've lost. We're all frontline leaders. They've lost regimental commanders. Let's help them bleed the Russian army dry. Why is that important? It's helpful for the United States of America. Do you really think Russia is going to invade NATO right now? There's no chance they could do that. They are not operationally set to do it. They don't have the leadership to do it. They don't have the troops to do it. So we're following the right pattern, but we're doing it almost a step slow. And ask yourself the question, why are we doing that? The reason is very simply there's a fear of escalation. We are afraid of what the Russians are going to do. And we should never be afraid of escalation. We should make them afraid of escalation. When you think about it, he's facing 3 nuclear powers, the French, the Brits, and ourselves. He's looking at a massive amount of forces out there. It would be the loss totally of Russia as Russia knows itself, and Putin knows it. And we shouldn't be afraid of that. The next steps are going to be very critical. And I think the next steps, we should have big concerns about it. And I hope this administration is looking at it. Because if he looks at like he may be losing, and he may be losing catastrophically, he may do something which is in their doctrine. And in their military doctrine is the use of nuclear weapons at the sub-kiloton level, something we don't have. We used to have a weapon system like that called the Davy Crockett in the 60s. We decided that wasn't a smart idea because we did not want a sergeant to start World War III. They've got them. They intend to use them. It's in their doctrine. Who wrote that doctrine? Gerasimov. Who's Gerasimov? He's their chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he's very close to Putin. So I think we're in the right path. We're slow getting there. I don't know why we're slow getting there. We should accelerate it. We should super escalate if we need to, and we shouldn't be afraid about escalation if it occurs.
John and Steve, I'm going to ask you for a very quick response to this before we go to questions because we're running late because of Senator Cruz's excellent presentation. Director Ratcliffe?
To what question specifically?
I'm sorry. Lessons from America First lessons from the experience in Ukraine.
Well, I think Senator Cruz did a fantastic job this morning of really laying out within Ukraine the problems of what happens when we don't follow an America First policy perspective, that this is more than just personalities of individual presidents in the White House, and very clearly the consequences of a reversal of policies across the board, not just in Ukraine, but around the world. We talked about Afghanistan and what's happening with China and other places. When you don't put America first, that it has a consequence around the world with our allies and with our adversaries, and that the world is less safe for everyone, and certainly less safe and secure for Americans and less prosperous. And I think we're seeing that as a direct result of a change in moving away from America First policies to policies that don't have that emphasis.
I agree with everything that has been put forward by our AFPI team on these key lessons learned, and I'd only really add just from the point of view of what lessons has China been learning from observing these developments, and what would a rational leader in China draw by way of lessons, with the caveat that we can't ever expect them to be 100% on the rational wavelength. First and foremost, it's incredibly important that the demonstration effect of what General Kellogg was talking about, of bleeding the Russian military dry by grinding away against a smaller nation that won an information war against what was supposed to be one of the strongest information warfare practitioners in Russia. I think it's no small matter that Ukraine, with the right kind of leadership, the right kind of communicator, was able to stand up and quickly turn world opinion against the aggressor. And you have to ask yourself, how long and hard has the Communist Party government of China been trying to protect itself against that possibility? What enabled Ukraine to be able to do that? What would enable China to try to guard against it? And it gets to one of the key, I think, lessons of the Ukraine tragedy. I think it's wonderful that they're winning, but they're still winning at a very high and I think unacceptable price. And that was the fact that people didn't take seriously dependencies. And the Communist government of China believes that it has the commanding heights of American society and government in its pocket. And if we talk about the energy dependency that Europe had on Russia, multiply it by 3 or 4 times, and that's what a lot of Americans and people around the world have on supply chains from China. And so we have to begin the critical work of taking care of America first, but to have lesser dependencies in order to have better options for a better outcome in the strategic competition with an adversary like Communist China. And so I think if we look at what the General was laying out about being a step late in this process, we need to be working proactively with allies that are forward deployed in Asia. We don't have a NATO in Asia, but we do have an ally in Japan that is uniquely awakening. I think they've seen what happened in Russia, Ukraine, and they are developing, I think, a much more forward-leaning, independently minded capability that I think, frankly, Americans in the world should welcome, as they are a true responsible stakeholder, unlike what a former Deputy Secretary of State referred to as China.
Steve, thank you so much. We have about 10 minutes left, but we would love to take some of your questions on this incredible program. We have some microphones to go around.
Thank you. I want to get all of your thoughts on a very interesting topic. The future of Vladimir Putin as head of the Russian Federation. Do you think that his invasion of Ukraine will spell the end of his government? And would a regime change in Russia be in American interests?
Yeah, I'll make it really brief and then pass it on. If I was Vladimir Putin today, I would have a food taster, and I would double up my bodyguards. You remember he has put his director of the 5th Directorate of the FSB, the follow-on to the KGB, he is currently in prison right now. And I think he's starting to look over his shoulder because I think it's turned into an absolute debacle, what's happening with him in Ukraine.
It may be too much for us to hope that there's going to be a coup, that Putin will be overthrown, but we do know that there's significant resistance and opposition to this war by Russian generals and by the Russian elite. I think the sanctions are going to have an effect on this country, but we know Putin has a very solid control of the security services. We just have to wonder how long this situation can go on. Will something break? But I'm not betting that there's going to be a coup, that Putin will be overthrown anytime soon.
I don't know at this point how this is going to play out. To the earlier point, part of what has kept Vladimir Putin in power is that, post fall of the Soviet Union, he delivered a better life to Russians after a decade of poverty and chaos. And if as a result of the sanctions in the long term that goes away, that threatens his ability as time goes by to remain in power. But we have to keep in mind, to the point earlier about being a step slow is, there's a difference between helping Ukraine and helping Ukraine win. And I'm not sure that this administration is committed to helping Ukraine win. Think about it. The closest this war came to a victory for Vladimir Putin and a defeat for the Ukrainian people was when this administration offered Volodymyr Zelensky a ride out of Ukraine 2 days into this conflict. Had President Zelensky taken the encouragement and offer of this current administration, there wouldn't be a war in Ukraine because Vladimir Putin would have a victory. So, where we stand right now is, for all of the things that have gone wrong for Vladimir Putin and the Russian army, control of Mariupol gives the opportunity for a land bridge between the south and east, and that gives an opportunity to claim more territory in the long run if he's successful with a renewed push, which gives him an opportunity to the Russian people to say, this was worth it. So how this plays out really is yet to be determined, and that's why it's important that the United States not only be engaged at this point, but engaged to help the Ukrainian people win.
Thank you. Another question?
Hello. Fred.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think we're probably approaching a more dangerous time in this entire Ukraine involvement than we have from the very start, because I think we're reaching a point where you're looking at, and John made that comment earlier, is Putin may be on an edge right now. On an edge right now, he's looking at strategic failure. He can say what he's done well, but he really want to take all of Ukraine. And so the next question is, in his mind, where is he going to go? And nuclear weapons they do have a play in their strategy, because they've got something that we don't have, which is the subkiloton stuff. Now, he threatens that with his newest ICBM, but he's also threatened other nuclear power in the British, and then the French are out there as well. And right now, this is something that I hope everybody's really starting to sit down and say, okay, we really need to think our way through this. What happens if he uses a nuclear weapons? And by the way, everybody needs to understand, in that they talk about what's called a demonstration. Well, a demonstration is the use of a nuclear weapon, not on troops or not on a city, but it's like in an open field, but to show that they're willing to use that. First time a nuclear weapon's been since ⁻⁵, because we were the last ones to use an atomic weapon for nuclear weapons. So I think it's a great question, and I think it deserves much more than just a quick flip answer. because it's going to take a lot of hard thought. But I think everybody in the back of their mind needs to think, we may be approaching a period where they are willing to do something that irrational because they are in the throes of potentially having what I would call a strategic defeat to the rest of the world. So it's a great question, no good answer.
I'll just comment briefly. This shows the need for missile defense. And French, you and I know very well that this is something that the Reagan administration, other administration invested in. And we don't simply have the Russian nuclear arsenal to have to deal with. I'm told I can take one more question. Sir?
I'm right here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, we'll take two more questions. There's someone else with a mic, and then we'll go to you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Max Castro Paredes. I'm from the Harvard Belfer Center. And my question is for you, General Kellogg. Given your extensive experience working on the Indo-Pacific and Asia, what would we do, or what do you recommend the administration in applying points of leverage to India? India has yet to denounce Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What leverage do we have, and what would be your recommendation? Thank you.
And it's a great question. But you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to, not because, I'm going to tell you the real smart guy we have in the room is right over there to the far right, to Steve Yates. So I'm going to let Steve answer that one, because we brought him in to be the China guy.
Well, here I am on the far right. The India challenge is a significant one. It's often forgotten that it's the other billion people on the continent of Asia, and we have had, I think, underinvested in our influence with India. But India has also had generations of ties to Moscow. Militarily, strategically, they also led the non-aligned movement. So there's a pretty deep resistance to picking a side. I would focus less in engaging New Delhi on getting them to outwardly focus on picking a side than getting them to substantively beef up what they're doing to tilt the scales. There's a lot that they can be doing to minimizing the influence operations that Moscow and Beijing, frankly, have engaged in to effectively co-opt international organizations. I think the most dramatic net effect was poisoning the world by lying about a virus that very clearly came from their country. And I think it would be a massive mistake for India to look at the degradation of Russia's capabilities and I think misuse of national power against Ukraine and think they want to double down on that as their future. So I think there's an opportunity there. Prime Minister Modi was a very open and active engagement partner with President Trump during those years. I think this is a time to reinvest in that, but also we have partners in Japan and Australia that make up the so-called Quad that are very actively engaging and looking at trying to create an alternative strategic and information structure to that Moscow Beijing pole that had emerged post-Olympics.
One more question. Yes, sir.
Director Ratcliffe and others. So during the talk today, Senator Cruz as well, all sort of touched on the reactive nature of our national security apparatus that is built in the industrial age, stuck in the industrial age, and also stuck on kinetics. What are your thoughts on moving it to the information age and more into the gray zone, or what I call cognitive warfare domain?
Well, I think it's an important point to focus on. It's one of the things, as you know, as the Director of National Intelligence, overall, one of the aspects of my role there was how should we be spending $85 billion a year in terms of supporting the best intelligence enterprise to support policymakers, and part of that was a shift into emerging technologies, and you see that, you know, our adversaries like Russia and China spending more on artificial intelligence, on hypersonics, on some of these things that, you know, that are changing as technology changes. And we did shift in my tenure there, spending in that regard. And I think it's, you know, it's absolutely vital, especially when you look at, you know, China's view of this is that information is power, and so much of what they're doing around the world doesn't have to do with gaining a kinetic edge. It has to do with gaining an edge with regard to information through technology. And so our focus absolutely needs to shift if we're to remain the world's great superpower.
Amen.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to wrap up now with a closing by our President, Brooke Rollins.
Well, just very quickly, help me thank our incredible panel. What an honor to work with you gentlemen every single day. And we were all together in some form or fashion in the last administration, but to continue on. I also want to thank our incredible events team, Daniel and Chase. Round of applause. They're the ones running around. Really incredible. And then our national security team, I see him behind the glass, Dr. Jacob Oldart, supporting our Center for American Security, and Gloria McDonald, and so many other great, incredible team members here at AFPI. Please help me welcome them, or thank them as well. You know, just a final thought, the outlines of the America First approach are simple as the recipe for the American greatness that we all inherited and then nearly lost. We anchor ourselves in the tradition of our founders, who knew that the defense of American liberty began at home, and also knew that it was occasionally necessary to land Marines in Tripoli or sweep French warships from the high seas. We root ourselves in the prudential wisdom of Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, who knew that the life of the Republic required uncompromising defense. And we moor ourselves in the vision of Eisenhower and Reagan and Trump, who distinguished themselves in their presidencies by the wars they did not fight, because they were each committed to a strong and deterring defense. And that is America First. So God bless you all. Thank you for being with us, and the fight continues. Thank you.